welcome to today's webinar. We want to invite all of you to this table to add in your thoughts and ideas and questions and comments. We're going to do a bit of an intro, and we'll let you know who's speaking today and let you know what's coming up in this three-part webinar. So this topic today is Community Food Assessments, a series brought to you in partnership with Food Policy Network, with MSU Center for Regional Food Systems, and with Food Communities Network. And we were very enthusiastic to bring this together and to have a platform for us to share stories together around doing food assessments with an equity focus, centering equity within that process. Because a lot of us are redoing community food assessments and or starting on community food assessments, given changing environment, given the rising food insecurity and attendant issues that we are all facing in our communities. And our hope today in sharing knowledge with some stories coming from particular communities, but then opening it up for you to share, is because we want to get further more effectively by building upon work that we're all doing, the excellent work that's happening in communities right across Turtle Island, Canada and United States. And very grateful for this partnership to broaden out expertise across Turtle Island. So just a little bit of webinar housekeeping. Please use the chat function as much as you would like to share ideas, to share comments, to share resources. Any resources that maybe you've been involved in putting together for community food assessments or that you might be aware of. Because what's going to be happening is we're going to send out an email at the end of all three webinars, this one, October and November, to all participants who participated in any one of those. And we're going to have the links to these recorded sessions if you want to refer back to them. But critically, we're going to have a list of curated resources that we draw from all of us together here. So please do add on in to the chat. If you have any questions that are coming along, there's going to be a couple of us speaking today, and then it will open up. But please add your questions as they come along, and we'll get to as many as we can. And Karen at Food Policy Network opened up the Q&A box in your Zoom platform there so that you can use that. Want to say a big thank you to Clea Souza, to Karen Basarab, and to Keesa Johnson for being on the planning team to make this happen and working to bring it together throughout the summer. And before doing anything else, I just wanted to start with a land acknowledgement. Coast to coast to coast here in the Northern Lands, the colonial government has identified September 30th as a day for truth and reconciliation. And the idea of that is to focus on Indigenous truth being able to be spoken, creating space, and more critically for settlers, which is every last person who isn't 100% Indigenous to these lands, and at some point in time, ancestry or yourself has come here, for settlers to focus on listening and to focus on what we do individually, what we do in our households, what we do in our communities and our organizations and our work, to build truth and reconciliation for the atrocities that have happened around colonialism. And so with that day coming upon us and with this topic, we see this coming together as all of our responsibilities, whatever our positionality is in our communities, to center equity in what we do. And that's what we wanted to focus on today, and learn from all of us coast to coast to coast. And I've been encouraged to talk about other coasts like the Great Lakes that separate some of our communities. and join some of our communities together as well. So with a deep acknowledgement of the lands within which we are all coming from, and aiming to connect more to and to the diverse communities that we are coming from and working with, we just want to stress the topic today: community food assessments and centering equity, and that the equity that we're talking about is not only ethnocultural, based on ethnocultural diversity, that it's a recognition of all of the diversity that we hold, whether that's by age, by class, by orientation, by personal identity, by status in terms of citizenship, by language, by spirituality, by beliefs. That this is the equity that we need to recognize, that hasn't always been at the forefront of the work to build food security and food resilience and food sovereignty. This webinar series also acknowledges that in our work, there is the multiple elements that build and take away food resilience, and that a focus on food is not to deny that, but it's a lens that we are bringing to this work, as is the equity lens, as is what we'll be talking about. It's sort of that community development and sovereignty lens. So with all of that, we invite you to participate in the next 2 sessions. I'm going to start. My name is Mo Garahan, and I'll be speaking from Algonquin region, Ottawa, which is in Indigenous Territories, Canada. And I'll be focusing on sort of neighborhood food assessments and community food assessments. And then my colleague, Keesa Johnson, will be working on speaking to you from a systems perspective on food assessments. And then we will be opening it up. So, and what we're going to do is we'll put some bios in the chat as we go along, but we're really just focused on our connections to this work. So before I start into the neighborhood pieces, I'd love to invite Keesa to say hello, introduce herself, and to let you know what is coming up in the series ahead.
Hello, everyone. How's you doing? Thank you so much for coming. We're excited to be here. My name is Keesa V. Johnson. I am a food systems design strategist. I have a contract with the Michigan Local Food Council Network, which is a part of the MSU Center for Regional Food System. I also wear a hat as a co-founder of the Equity and Access Group. In my community, I am the chair of my local food policy council. I was taught at a very early age, and I believe I'm paraphrasing, that service is how I pay rent in this world. And I just wanted to start that grounding out for you all, because doing community food assessments is communal work. It may seem like it's transactional here and there, but it's based on community, deep-rooted roots in community. So our next session, I'll just to let you know, is laying a foundation for equitable community food assessments. It will be Thursday, the 26th. And we'll be talking a little bit, and here's our registration. We'll go more in detail about what is an equitable community food assessment. We'll talk about foundational concepts, centering, discussing agreements, conditions, and resources that need to be present. And then we'll discuss the role and power dynamics in preparing for a CFA. Our third one is reflections from the ground on equitable community food assessments. All right. I am putting it in the chat now. That will be Thursday, October 17th from 2 to 3:30. We hope that we will see you there. Here's also a registration link if you have not registered. In that session, we'll be talking more about hearing perspectives on how to implement community food assessments. for those who conducted one with an equity lens, and then we'll discuss challenges in transforming like a traditional CFA approach and lessons learned. And then we'll share some essential value of using like an equity lens in a CFA and how, to use the approach for transformative actions and solutions within your communities. So I'm glad to see you here, and I hope to see you in the next 2 sessions as well.
Okay, and now this is my fault. We did do some date changing. So I am just going to ask Karen to make sure that you pop in. The next one is in October, and the next one after that is in November. So the next two. So that's, but you got everything else right. And it's just because we did do some change around. So thanks for that, Keesa.
Okay.
Awesome.
Right. Okay, we go. You can advance the slide, Kalia.
All right. Anything else that the organizing team would like to say before we kick off to the neighborhood food assessment?
Yeah.
All right.
And you could drop it off, Kalia. Yeah.
Okay. So what I'd like to, this is with my Just Food hat on. We've been working with a community development. And so again, this is about storytelling. And I want to tell you a bit about the story of how we've done some community food assessments and what we've been learning through our time and what we're building now, and really looking to hear from expertise that you're bringing in relation to this. So a lot of what we're told, we know that a lot of it is around mapping, that we are told in very strict sort of lines of standard community food assessments. There tends to be some standard components of that, gathering people together, looking at a specific map of the area, working on gathering data and research, getting input from various ways, rolling that up into a narrative, and having that influence next steps. And that very linear way is how we did approach the work 10 years ago. And at this point, we are building upon that, but redoing more of an iterative approach that is steeped in a couple of lenses. So one, I just wanted to share with you, and I'd ask Kate to put the slide up. So I'll ask Lee if you can take down neighborhood food assessment, and then Kate, if you can pop up good food as a definition. And so one of the things we learned from doing it 10 years ago is we had over 1,000 people meet in small tables in neighborhood levels to have a conversation. And that was a vital component of ensuring that there was an accessible way to feed into a broader picture of an assessment and a policy that came out of that. So that kitchen table talk is something we felt really good about, and are repeating that format. And I want to just give one story that came out of one particularly grueling kitchen table talk where this definition came out of, and it engaged people around the table who were whose culturally relevant diet was meat, and people whose chosen relevant diet was veganism. And both sides felt very strong about the need to have policy to emphasize and prioritize that chosen diet. And it was incredible to watch community come together with very strongly held, deep-rooted beliefs, learn about those beliefs from each other, and they themselves come up with language that then reflected inclusiveness of those positions into a definition of good food that we have used going forward in our work, with that understanding that oftentimes I think people might think of good food as a framing, meaning there's bad food, and bringing in some of that shame with food. But the community who built this together identified it as what's good for our bodies, what's good for our souls, what's good for our environments. and what's good for our food system. And so I wanted to focus on that as working to find inclusive language, again, broadening out from some of the work that many of us are doing in communities to reflect our language, inclusive of demographic diversity, moving through to what does that look like when we are seeking to build an assessment. What are we assessing in the first place? Bringing that down to first principles and taking the time to develop a definition that really does invite people in. Thanks, Kate. You can pop that off. One of the other changes that we are doing is bring it right down to a neighborhood level. And so I wanted to talk about one neighborhood that we're presently working in, and the definition of neighborhood that began this assessment. And oftentimes our definitions of neighborhoods are described by geopolitical boundaries or municipal definitions of neighborhood. And we really saw how the definition of neighborhood changes with people's experience. And in this particular neighborhood, which is very high in newcomer populations and residents to this community, the definition was scaled right down to the 3 large apartment buildings. And one of the things that we're seeing is with that increased mobility of people leaving the community with kids going to school or busing to key stores and that type of thing, corridors of transportation cutting down a community to even cross over to another building that's in close proximity. It can leave neighborhoods to define more as the buildings that we live in. And we start from the definition that neighborhoods want to start in. And we have adapted our food assessment tool to work within smaller geographic communities, at a building level, within a faith community, within a demographic identified community that might be over a broader geography. We want this toolkit, Where's the Food, and we will be sharing it out with the resource list in November. We want that toolkit to allow for these conversations to be facilitated wherever people are interested in coming together, and that can then roll up to some of the food policy opportunities for those that are interested in that. And I think many of us are working on establishing youth sides, which we are doing as well as mainline food policy groups. Part of the idea also around, that good food definition is an aspirational element. The reality is that in this one community, the majority of people walk to a very large franchised corporate box grocery store, and with very high prices. And so while we do simultaneously work on building out options of accessing food that might hit on more of those good food definitions, the reality is we are simultaneously working with this community to ensure that the walkway is not blocked off. There's a proposal that would be blocked off because of its unsafe nature, particularly in our difficult winters, and instead to work on making sure that would be maintained as a pathway. These can all operate at the same time. And one of the things that we have moved away from in terms of a more linear process is we only engage in an iterative process at this point. So when we're doing a community food assessment now at a neighborhood level, which then rolls up to the community level, we are ensuring that we're going to be there for a 2 to 3 year period. So that, and this comes from our community development lens. And what I just want to talk a bit about there is, as a community developer by trade and as an organization with that as our key lens, our interest is in building education together, recognizing the expertise in every person at that table, bringing a suite of solutions to kick things off for sure, and then moving with the interest of who's coming to the table at that point, and that the actions to implement are done at the same time as we are continuing our analysis. And so that's the very popular education style of starting with the information we have, building some analysis, building some solutions, testing those solutions, bringing that back into that reflection spiral. And we have found that that process is what is required to build these relationships, to have people show up to do the work of transforming our food system, because it's not a paper exercise to have a food assessment. It is an iterative, action-oriented, change-making process with shared information throughout that time. And so our hope and my understanding from some of my mentors is that these processes of building, food charters or food assessments or food strategies, these processes are only as good as the relationships that are developed through these processes that will continue to do the work. And so if it is not centered on building those relationships over time, largely it becomes a bit of a check-off box exercise to elevate, some one-time maybe policy influence, but it's not strengthening our community to transform our food system, because that's long-term trust building, relationship building, equity seeking work. Let me just check my notes here. Yeah, another thing that I will just highlight, and I'm just going to check on my time here. Where are we? Okay. Another thing I will highlight is we had to radically change our approach. I think a lot of us are used to gearing up by building out slide presentations in this day and age of a lot of technology. We don't use PowerPoint presentations at all when we're doing our neighborhood assessments that are rolling up into a community-wide assessment. We're going in, sitting in circle, times when people are already coming together, making sure that there's tools that are available for kids to participate in and or be distracted, so adults can participate, ensuring that older kids have a way of supporting the involvement, being extremely fluid with time. And so marking out a large chunk of time to engage, because we know that people are coming and going, and figuring out ways for people to engage in the questions and ideas that still works with their needs around family times, work times. Partnering with nonprofit organizations that also have relationships in the neighborhoods, so that we again are building together upon relationships that have been created. We do work to understand language diversity in neighborhoods, and work to have people who are able to do translation in real time, so that, and again, having the time so that that translation can be supported back and forth. And I guess what I want to say is, wrapping up from neighborhood level to community level, what it's allowed us to do is, for example, we have a collective kitchen facilitation guide that we've had for over 20 years. Each one of these processes, we open up all of our assets to ensure that the lessons that we learn from a particular community are incorporated into our tools for operational implementation. So for example, we've had pretty guided ways to establish collective kitchens that use a more economical, sustainable approach and peer facilitation. And in this recent community, they really informed us that their interest was on not necessarily making food together, but on actually learning. The starting place was literally how each of the different households that are working on this across a high level of ethnocultural diversity, how each of them makes their rice was the first request for a collective kitchen. And so that kind of starting place to build knowledge, to build skills, to build relationship, we want to then incorporate back into our collective kitchen design, because we didn't have that kind of starting place. It was a bit more prescriptive from the past. And so really learning from that community development approach, it only will effectively translate into community development if it is incorporated in as valuable information throughout anything that we are working with in community, while simultaneously, when communities identify within a community food assessment process a systemic issue, and I will be looking to Keesa to speak more on this, that it is our job as community developers to ensure that there is a connection. It's not just voicing and articulating what that need is, but we feel that if we are asking for that question, we have a responsibility to use whatever levers that we might have as nonprofit organizations to make that connection to system leadership in order to shift things as quickly as possible. And again, not waiting for the end of a year or 2 year period, which these community food assessments can take, of course. But how do you ensure the taking our responsibility and our sort of reciprocal interest in working with each other seriously, so that we are connecting those needs as soon as we can to folks that can influence change as quickly as possible. Just looking here. I might stop there, noting that I will be bringing together some other pieces potentially in our conversations. But I think what I'll do, I'm just making sure I have everything. Yeah. So those are some of the key things that we've been learning within community food assessments, and working as largely settler, largely white identified facilitators to ensure that that facilitation role is one of only facilitation and not driving outcomes, not coming with preconceived notions of even what that meeting will be. With that, I do want to also say to everyone here that we did have Halifax coming to speak today around their approach to community food assessments, and a really great toolkit that they've put together that I think will be useful for many. They all came down with the team presenter came down with COVID, and in their broader team, and just very ill this morning. So we aren't able to hear from them right now, but they will be including their information in the resource information being sent out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Keesa to then step up. I'm going to read the chats of comments and questions that have come in, and then we'll address those and open up the floor thereafter. So Keesa, over to yourself. And so that's at the systems level, Kalia, if you're.
Yeah, I got it. I got it. All right. Yeah. Oh, you're reading something from the thing. All right. So we went from storytelling from a neighborhood food assessment level, which is so important, and I'll talk more about that. And then we talked about it a little bit from the community level, right? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about systems, which it encompasses a lot of things. We're not going to be able to get to every point, but I'm here to engage in a bit of story with you, if that's okay. All right. So for me, when I start off, because I'll tell you a little bit more about myself as we talk, because that's important, especially when doing community food assessment. It is pleasant to know that in color informing features, I am related to the first successful tillers of the store, to the people who taught the world agriculture. And I'm so happy about it. I'm even so happy about it is that, when I look at my positionality on who I am growing up, as a Black woman in the state of Michigan, right off the shores of Lake Michigamme, is where I got my start, my whole totality of being. Many people say that I move like the depths and the rivers and the currents of Lake Michigamme, and I was so humbly pleasant that I was able to grow up in a very small, all Black town, all Black city, which was called Muskegon Heights. It's much different now due to gentrification, but the beauty still hasn't left. Lake Michigan is just breathtaking. It's beautiful, all right? So I'm part of Turtle Island. I'm part of North America. I'm part of this history. I'm part of this story, okay? So I like to start off talking about community, and I want to talk a little bit about a loving community, because community cannot take root in a divided life. Long before community assumes external shape and form, it must be present as a seed in the undivided self. It's a lot about self first before we start talking about community, and we talk about neighborhoods, we talk about systems. Only as we are in communion with ourselves can we find communities in others. So to ensure human survival everywhere in the world, we organize into communities. Communities sustain life, not not just like nuclear families or like the couple, and certainly not the individual. There is no better place to learn the art of loving and how to love yourself than in community. All right. We were all born into a world of community. Like, think about it. Rarely, if everyone does a child, like, rarely does a child come into the world in isolation with only one or two onlookers. Children are born into the world surrounded by the possibility of community. And how many people helped us get there? It's like family, doctors, nurses, could be a midwife, could be a nurse, it could be your father, could be your uncle, could be a neighbor. uh, Admiring strangers who think you are like gorgeous. Look at them, they're so gorgeous. And these field connections, so many field connections, some more intimate than others. But much of the talk of family values in our society highlights the nuclear family. And, sometimes it's the mother and the father and maybe a few kids. But of course, that's a fantasy. It is. It's a fantasy. We do not, it's so many other people that we touch within our lives. It's not just that image. Like hardly anyone just lives like that. There's a small unit within a larger unit of connected kin, right? Yet capitalism and patriarchy together as a structure of domination have worked overtime to undermine and destroy this larger unit of extended kin. They replaced the family, neighborhood, and community with a more privatized, small, autocratic unit, which helps to increase alienation and makes abuses of power more possible. See, when we're not thinking that we're not connected and the harm of one person isn't not dependent on how we see ourselves, we get into these interlocking systems of domination that define our reality. And Bell Hooks is one person who speaks very eloquently and strongly and resiliently, rest her soul, about the imperialism, the colonialism, the capitalism, the white supremacist patriarchal system that we live in. It can be very transactional. So we have to understand this. The US food system has been created and shaped by racial injustice since its inception. There's never been a thing called, not in America, a just and equitable food system. That's for us to do. That's for us to figure out what kind of ancestors we want to be and what our children's choose to be. There's never been anything like that. Racism is tied to power structure and access to resources. And oppression is so unjust, is this unjust treatment that it picks and pries on you in very individual harmful acts, which creates this harmful reaction to you even understanding if you're loved or not, or you have compassion or not, because it's right there. It affects everything. Institutional racism is real, and it's very strong and very prevalent. It's a very 20th century thinking, but today we're in the 21st century, right? We create something different today together. So how can we prepare for the future if we can't acknowledge our past? We have to, in various ways. Like, there's a history of discrimination in the food system, whether it's from sharecropping, urban planning, immigration laws, racial wealth gaps, housing, land appropriations is deeply baked within the politics and the individual, because systems are people, right? Here's a map of systematic oppression, because it is just not, well, it is racial equity. Because of you have to fight for racial equity, you have all these isms that come out that create this world and this space of these polarizing views, whether it's from an individual level to an interpersonal level, to an institutional level, to a structural level. But as food policy council members or community members who want to give an adequate food assessment, how do we look through a different lens and understand that this oppression is real and it's out here, okay? And a lot of us can be blind to the reality of it. So we have to unpack whiteness. We gotta unpack it. It takes a lot of learning to recognize how we've been socialized into white supremacy culture. Even myself as a Black woman getting up every day, because of the pervasive system, I always have to be very mindful of how I'm engaging with other people, because it does isolate us in a way. And we have to relearn about the history of systematic racism to operate differently. How does it show up? Remember, it shows up in that individualistic point of view. It shows up in paternalism. It shows up in neoliberalism. You may hear terms in the food system, if they only knew, vote with your fork. Communities can't take care of themselves. They're not listening. They're just not listening. We're just gonna build it and it'll come. No, they just gotta pull themselves up from the bootstraps. And then a lot of focus on like charity and a lot of focus on good versus bad food. But there's wonderful solutions to this, okay? Whiteness just permeates the food system in ways that it articulates white ideas of health and nutrition. It often whitens dreams of farming and gardening that erase past and present of like race and agriculture. It does a lot of things, but we can overcome it, right? Like we can, it's a lot of like self-reflection in all of us to be able to get this done together. So I go back to us in that communal world. Like most world citizens do not, like even if they have material resources, they don't live in small segregated units. They live in large family units, okay? And so like, here's some reflection questions when you're thinking about community food assessments. Like, what does family mean to me? What does my family mean? How do I fit? Like, what does living in an actual neighborhood mean today in the 21st century? Like, what is my community? How do I map that to get it out my head, to make it more visual? And how does it fit within my local policy, within my city, like my county, my state? Like, where does my family, where does my community, where do we fit? M. Scott Peck has a book called The Different Drum. It's Community Making and Peace. His definition of community is the coming together of a group of individuals who have learned how to communicate honestly with each other, whose relationships go deeper than their massive composure and have developed some significant commitment to rejoice together, mourn together, eat together, delight in each other, and make others' conditions our very own. The extended family is a good place to learn about the power of community. However, it can only be a community if there's honest communication between the individuals in it. Communication cannot be muddled, and that's why community food assessments are pretty iterative. You getting your communication together, and yeah, sometimes it may be conflict. That's why there's some good resources out here on how to deal with conflict within our community. If we look at generations back and before, a lot of the baby boomers and those before, they weren't really taught how to handle conflict. But talking together is one way you build community. And if we do not experience love in our own extended families of origin, which is the first community offered to us, then we find it through friendship, okay? Loving friendships provide us with a space to experience the joy of community in a relationship where we learn to process like issues, to cope with differences and conflict while staying connected. And that is a true heart of what you do when you're doing a community food assessment. You're talking to all these different people. You're building all these connections and friendships along the way. I had a story about I got a quick story about a community member. She was just real upset. We had started a coalition and she was just upset, just real upset about what had happened and transpired. And so we said, hey, let's get a circle together. Let's talk about these things. Let's figure these things out, because she was much needed to be part of the coalition. And so she needed time for solitude. And that's like deep reflection about like what happened. After moving from solitude, like she went into her solitude and she reflected about it. And she was just like, you know what? It's not worth it. We got a bigger goal. And they talked, they got through it. We got through our assessment together. So moving from a deep place of reflection into community heightens our capacity for fellowship with one another. You have to get through the conflict, because through fellowship, we learn how to serve one another, and service is just another dimension of communal love. You know, the willingness to sacrifice is also a dimension of communal and a loving practice in living in community. I never understood what my parents would say, like, hey, you're gonna have to volunteer. You're gonna have to give voter register. This is just part of living in the necessary space, and living in community is just some responsibilities you have to take on. Just like a community food assessment, there's some responsibilities when we go through community food assessments that we have to take on for living in the space that we live in. And giving up on something is one way we can not giving up on something is one way to sustain a commitment to our overall collective well-being in our food shed. And our willingness to make sacrifices reflects our awareness of how interdependent we are. So Martin Luther King has said, you know, he was trying to figure out the need to bridge the gulf between the rich and the poor. And he said, he preached, all men and women are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever artifacts one directly affects all indirectly. And the gulf he was attempting to bridge is by sharing resources. And that's one component that's a part of the anatomy of the community of food assessment. You're looking at resources. What do we have? What's in our local food shed? Who has this? Who has that? You're getting together in communion, in friendship with other people, figuring out this type of information. You know, mutuality, mutual giving, it strengthens our communities, okay? Okay, so enjoying the benefits of living and loving in community empowers us to meet strangers without fear and to extend them the gift of openness and recognition. Just speaking to a stranger, acknowledging their presence on a planet, we make a connection, you know? Every day we have an opportunity to practice the lessons learned in community. In this book that I read called The Different Drum by Peck, who's the author, he reminds us that the goal of genuine community is to seek easy in which to live with ourselves and others in love, respect, and peace. And so unlike other movements for social change that requires joining organizations and attending meetings, as food policy councils and community members, we can begin the process of making a community with just exactly where we are. You know, sharing a smile, a warm greeting, a bit of conversation by doing a kind deed, by acknowledging kindness offered to us. We do this, and we do this sharing a smile, a warm greeting, a bit of conversation, doing a good deed, acknowledging kindness offered to us. Daily, we can work to bring our communities and families into a greater community with one another. I'm sorry.
Whatever you need.
Okay, so community food assessments goal is to enhance a feeling of belonging. We're here. Wherever you hear friends about a stranger, we encourage people to seek a path of healing and seek the restoration of bounds. Community food assessments allows us to stay connected over time, and we can see major and positive change. However we choose to heal, however we choose to walk up to the plate, community teaches us how to love, right? All right. So if systems of oppression and inequalities and inequities are designing with equity in the first place needs to be at the forefront in the center of our minds and hearts. If we know what kind of society we're currently in, but we're at the cusp of the place in the 21st century where we're here to build a new reality. So who's willing to do that? Me. Who's willing to do that? Okay. So components of a community food assessment. Yes, assess your readiness. You got to develop a mindset for a brave and equitable space, center, and community. You have to conduct meetings with diverse people. You have to create community agreements, develop shared language, share goals, discuss power, create a map of your environment. And it starts with you first. You have to create a map for yourself to understand what is your community. So then you start talking to other people. And they bring their maps as well. See, that's how mapping starts. It doesn't start with like, just what resources we have. It starts with community mapping of ourselves and our team and the people that we're working with. And then find more, develop more team members, interested community members. Start doing a scan, just a scan, asking people like, oh, can you do a food audit in your neighborhood? Can you do a food audit in your city? Identify what is joyful about this, because this should be a joyful, like you want to talk about what brings you joy when it comes to your food shed. What are the stories? What are the hidden stories that you don't know about your neighborhood? What are things that people smile about? Where are they getting their food? And what information is missing? Then identify firsthand information that's needed, that's not in the secondary reports that you go out and say like, hey, we have data. Let's look at the secondary data. What's missing in this data? And it's typically the firsthand accounts, because what I want everybody to understand is that community food assessments is a snapshot. It's a portrait in time where we're all contributing to like what this story is, you know? And then you still in communion with your community members, and there's different people that come in, that come out, but the talking, the giving, the rejoicing, the getting through conflict, it just builds a better community. So you do some analysis and synthesis with your information, and then you create an action plan with policies that address your community needs. Then you go look and see what policy has been created in the local space, but what policies would address your needs as community members. Okay. And then celebrate. Yeah. All this work, all this time, all this energy, and we figured out this is how we're going to celebrate with the world. We're going to have a food summit. We're going to have a dinner. We're going to have the best food ever. We've been talking to so many farmers. We've been talking to so many food entrepreneurs. We're going to celebrate together in an amazing space. So the anatomy of it, though, be an inclusive leader. There's a crisis that we're going through now because there's so many 20th century leaders and we're living in the 21st century. Be inclusive. Learn how to have honest communication and discussion. Create friendships. Friendships always last. And sometimes there's a reason and season that they come and go, but when we're in community, we're just learning together. And have a deep understanding about reflection and compassion. Learning how to be compassionate to yourself, and then also understanding that you're walking into this whole new world of space of, I know that person, I know that person, and so many learnings that you're going to have, and sacrifice. Some things you're just not going to get, just not going to get. Some things you are, but it's always about the greater good of the community, the communal self. It's not individual. You know, and belonging. All of this creates a greater sense of belonging. If you're asking diverse co-creators to come to the table, people you've never spoken to before, or even some people you probably keep at arm's length, and you learn a food story or two, and you have a whole different perspective, all of this creates an amazing sense of belonging, you know? So I'd like to thank you for that presentation and that time and listening to my story about the importance of community food assessments. And I will open it up for questions.
Amazing, Keesa. Thank you so much. So folks, you've seen a little bit of sort of nitty-gritty logistics at a neighborhood level, and then being inspired by Keesa at that extraordinary systemic level and bringing that down to our roles and responsibilities within there. I just wanted to touch base on one quick conversation. Really appreciate it, Kalia, and I'm looking for your name. I think it's Jay. So just a clarification on the statement that I made around the slideshows. Certainly we've just witnessed a connection being made with a slide deck. We found that there were spaces we were going into that didn't have electricity, like in a space to be able to hold that. We found that we were going into spaces that there was multiple languages that that affected the utility of a slideshow, but certainly visual tools, and tools for people to engage in visual mapping, in expressing visually, in sharing concepts visually, 100% find useful. That was just a lesson that we had learned, that we have to ensure that the tools that we're looking at are reflective of the communities we're working within and the interests there. So I just want to clarify that. That's the one question that was in, there's a Q&A area that if people want to post in there or in the chat, whatever is easiest to you. And or comments. It is coming up to the 12 o'clock mark. We do have the ability to stay for a half hour, and we'll just stay until people are finished with comments and questions. So anything you'd like to add in, anybody at all?
There's another question in the Q&A from Jay. Any suggestions on how to build that community when we are ultra rural and work across 6 counties? I don't live in a neighborhood nor near pockets of people.
That's really good. Did you want to try that more? Or
Yeah. And again, this is a conversation. So anyone with experience who wants to add in, just unmute and add in. Certainly, I think that with the online tools, we've had both benefits and challenges in rural communities where there's sometimes increased access, but sometimes things like, you know, if people are interested in writing things together, like Google Docs or Zooms and stuff, sometimes just don't function well enough. I think that some things we've tried is going to things like adding on to rural events where people are already coming together. I know that some people have used community spaces in rural areas to help foster an ongoing connection to that space with a group of people. Those are things that I can speak from things that we've done. We are a rural city and in a rural region, so we have worked in rural areas across different, as you said, Jay, counties. Perfect. Start a farmer's market, Wadia, thank you. Or at a farmer's market. That's an absolutely great way to connect with folks.
yeah, there's a lot of, I talk to a lot of rural farmers, like all colors, it doesn't matter. And some ways I hear, like, first they kind of like start with themselves and then they find like a group. Like I will always talk to them about Food Policy Council. They're like, Keesa, what are you talking about? You know? And then I was like, well, do you have a church or some kind of like, something you do outside the home? But for me personally, I think it's always good to start with self and then start with my family that's around me, just having those conversations, because it changes so much. Like when I had to do my personal map, and we'll talk more about them in other sessions, these personal like mind maps, these like they change because you start seeing the world a little bit more differently. And so I say start with yourself, start with your personal family, church, organizations, or even your girlfriends, boyfriends, friends. I would start from there. But a Food Policy Council is also a wonderful place to commune as well. Your local Food Policy Council.
Thank you. There was another question in the chat. Are there examples of shared language and agreements that folks would be able to share? Would love to hear and learn more about the process of developing these collaborative agreements.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. In our next session, we're going to talk more about them. And so we'll probably share, like, we'll definitely share some examples for you to get started. They're great. It takes a while, yeah. Like it's linear, it's not linear work, like it's iterative. So like you have to want to like talk to people to be able to develop it and do it. Sometimes it takes a couple of days together. Sometimes it could take a week, but we definitely will make sure that we give you some resources to view. Thank you for that question. Thank you.
And a reminder for anyone who has some, even if they might be a little bit outdated, that and comments that you might be making on them, it does help us to build upon each other's work. So please share those along as well.
Something I can jump in and say about community agreements, going back to what Keesa said, how are you defining community in the first place? who is a part of creating this collaborative agreement. And gosh, when you get into an agreement, we're talking about language, right? And what means one thing to one person or one group may have a totally different connotation for someone else. So then you start to get into some of those equity components. But some of the things you can be thinking about is the idea of data sovereignty, for example. If I am telling you a personal story, you know, you may be using that as data, but how that gets shared, disseminated, what happens with it matters. And sometimes another example is these community food assessments are done. People are giving their information, but they don't hear anything back after it's said and done, nor have any say-so in the decision-making around what the priorities are, what the actions are going to be. So those might be some things that you explore and consider in the development of community agreements.
Could I ask a question? Sorry to just jump in, but I live in Oklahoma, and we have a multitude of indigenous tribal presence here, and many different nations represented with capital presence here. And what we're observing is that the food systems within the tribes are growing at a faster pace and a greater pace than the food system outside of the tribes, and that communication between the two systems, the two different presences, is not easy to establish. So I'm just wondering if anyone has had tribal interaction and how that's played out, I guess.
I know Keesa is working to bring together Indigenous-led experience into some of the other webinars. And there are some great examples of communities that have engaged across settler and Indigenous leadership. I think of Thunder Bay as a strong example, coast here in Indigenous Territories, Canada. So that's something that we can bring forward in terms of resources to take a look at. And one of the things we'd love to share out is contact information with those that are willing to share it for people to follow up with conversation. But certainly that's part of the focus in some of the upcoming webinars.
Great, thank you.
As one contribution, but if anyone on the call has experience yourself, please add in.
I'll just jump in. Sorry, folks, I'm feeling a little under the weather, so I'm trying to minimize screens. But I think to help with Christy's answer, it is relational again. I'm trying to figure out how to capture it, but moving at the speed of trust is the hardest thing to do. But lots of visiting and checking in. And yeah, I would even say like recognizing it's anecdotal stories can be data. And I love the sovereignty of the sovereignness of it. But even just checking in with what stories and data would you like me to advocate on behalf of? And yeah, I guess, and from my experience, it's being completely transparent, allowing myself to fall in front of folks and asking what the best way to get up is. But very, very relational. And to be honest, my first thing is sharing my power and my privilege. So hi, I'm for this network. I wear these hats. This is my agenda. Transparency. Yeah, this is the document I carry behind the hat I wear. Personally, these are my beliefs. These are my, but again, food brings it together. So visiting and sharing time around food, from my experience, has been the best place and space to start building relationships. But moving at the speed of trust is a very intentional policy shifting tool, I'd say, but I'm not quite sure how to measure it.
Thank you, Michelle. I do want to add that we have a governor who's quite antagonistic with the tribes, and a white male who just makes it much more hard to build trust. So, but thank you for everything you offered. Agree upon it.
I think if those are your opinions and other people share it, you could share, and that could start some relatability and humanness. That's what I have found. Sorry, I'm also calling in from Treaty 7, Alberta. We have very interesting politics here. So I hear ya. Pull them in, call it out.
We do, we try. Thank you.
I'm just going to bring up another question that people can also add in on from Raina. I'm curious about how an approach for a food assessment would be different if it's coordinated via a community local government versus via contractor. One thing I would just love to add on that is I believe that the coordination is not necessarily the right word. It is around a team of facilitation. And so it's not so much who is doing it as much as what is their approach. And I think that's what is critical. And I do think that our local communities need to be funding this work in good measure to allow for these outcomes. I do think that, and this is just my contribution, I do think that there's many locations from which this can come from. But ideally recognition of the work and effort of all of the individuals that are involved, the time and investment. And so where there are funds to support this, that's part of the equitable lens that is used from the outset, is where best are those funds served, who's making the decision about how those funds would be distributed, and a recognition of all of the engagement that is required to do a complex, a rich, a meaningful community food assessment.
I also like to add, the reason why it's community, like, it's deeply rooted in the members who actually live and function within the community, within that system. And if you're if you're focusing on sovereignty, especially food sovereignty, the government, educational institutions, USDA, none of these people should be leading any of those conversations. They can help facilitate, and they can be part of the stakeholders and the constituents of when you're gathering people together, but you're there to do community design. The power has to be shared amongst the community members, and the community members should be very prevalent. You should be facilitating sessions, and sometimes it may be areas you're curious about, and that's the beauty of it. You should be very insatiably curious about finding out information, because it's a God-given right about like where you live at. That's you practicing your civic responsibility. So they can be at the table, but they're at the same level playing field as everyone else.
I think maybe Mo was starting to say something about this earlier, and it ties into the modes of engagement conversation that was happening, that a community food assessment can end up being this very large undertaking where you end up with a 100-page document that's looking at all these different pieces of the food system that may or may not mean something to people and their positionality and how they're experiencing it on a daily basis. So different folks will be attracted to different things and use different pieces in different ways based on what their stake and their understanding is. Speaking to a single mother in the community who this is my priority and these are my challenges versus someone who is a public health official and they're going to look at it this way, there's going to be bias all across based on personal experience. I think that is something definitely to keep the like front of your mind, but also these 100-page documents, 5-year plans, what can be done immediately? Even as you are gathering information, what is actionable? And people will also build relationships through the action of doing something together, you know, as opposed to waiting until 2 years after this is done. And data conditions are changing quickly. What can you be doing as you are gathering the data to mobilize people around, to act as a tool for engagement and relationship development?
Okay, well, let's bring in Laura's question. Can you speak to framing the approach as community food assessments versus food asset mapping? I've read both in the literature. Keesa, do you want to start on that? Or do you want me to?
No, for me, when you look at the larger system, asset mapping is just kind of like, it's part of it. It's like a part of the community food assessments. There's various other components of it. So asset mapping is great because you should know like what is positive, what do you have going on in your local food community, and how does that affect other people? Like where's the gaps? But that's just like one start. That's like you do have to map. And I do like approaching things from an asset perspective versus a deficit perspective, where there's like, well, deficit is more like very negative, but when you're looking at it from an asset perspective, you're talking about the joys, you're talking about what's positive, you're looking at what's here and what's there, what do we have in totality, and then that's when you're able to say like, whoa, we don't have this. Let me look at that health data report. Okay, it says this. That's because we don't have this right here. We don't have enough farmers. we don't have enough gardens. We don't have enough people cooking or making food. Just a lot of swamps in the area. Why are there all these food swamps? See, those are talked about in zoning meetings. Planning and zoning meetings. These, they use the government uses these like ecological terms, but they're man-made, they're man-created, they're decisions being made where these businesses are located and who has what and when and what highway is right here, so yeah, asset mapping is a part of it.
Running down to Mara, maybe we'll get to this in session 2 or 3, but what are the ways folks have shared data or stuff coming out of the assessment? And I do think that's being covered a little bit, but does anyone want to spark a thought there?
Yeah, one way is setting up online dashboards so that you can track progress and plans and continuously update on whatever actions have been created coming out of the community food assessment.
Do you have any training you would recommend for someone who is new to helping to lead this process?
I can add some thoughts, but again, looking for folks but certainly facilitation with an equity lens is the core. And for myself, I really do feel that having more of a community development approach, as opposed to a sort of as much as the technical elements of a community food assessment are critical, and an understanding of moving ideas through to policy and back again. But to me, that community development framework does help to identify how to do that in a way that is inclusive. Those would be 2 of the core areas that I would be suggesting. Other folks in terms of ideas on which skills to strengthen.
Mo, you took the words out of my mouth, having strong facilitation skills. is very important. And I've conducted community food assessments. I've led strategic planning processes. And my background is not specifically in food systems. It is in, by educational training, whatever, community development, public health, a lot rooted in democratic participation and civic engagement. And that, I can say, allows the conversation and the dialogue that needs to happen to guide a process and collaborative decision-making.
I'll grab Jay in a sec. I do want to do a shout out to Vital Village Network, who does some great work around using technical platforms to facilitate participatory processes. So we'll definitely include links to their wonderful training, which was really inspired us in our community to look at some more creative technical tools to facilitate that kind of participation. Jay, you had your hand up. If you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, thanks. This was in response to the question about how to share back information. And yeah, an online platform is great for some people. I'm dealing with a lot of elderly people and people who just don't want to use the internet or phones. One of the things I keep bumping up against is like making language really accessible. And like, so I've done a food and ag assessment, published a 76-page report. I can't expect anybody to read that. So we're going to be making these one-pagers that are, more illustrative, graphic, and just very simple to understand some of the larger concepts in it. And then also I keep getting hung up on too. I translate a lot of stuff into Spanish with my partners. I don't do it. And how so much translation ends up being language that isn't used in the vernacular, isn't day-to-day language. And so, really keeping in mind your audience and their reading levels, and that it can't be academic and, political language, because it's just gonna not make any sense to people.
All right, folks. Well, with that, bidding everyone a great day. Take good care, and we'll see you at the next webinar, hopefully.
Thanks, everyone.